Welcome to CinemaSpection. I'm Tim, and for this episode, I'm going to be discussing the return of Salem Horror Fest. It's been over a year since the 5th iteration of the festival, but for number 6, festival founder and director Kay Lynch made the excellent decision to put it off for a year so it could be rescheduled for April, moving it away from Salem's Halloween celebrations and sparing it from the October crush of tourists. With more room to breathe, the festival offers an even larger crop of exciting new independent horror films to discuss. So I'm going to talk about some of the movies I got to see as part of the festival's first weekend, running from Thursday, April 20th to Saturday, April 22nd. Programming for the weekend actually ran until Sunday, but I had to take that day off from sheer exhaustion. This film festival business, it's a game for the young. Now, last time I discussed the festival, we were still coming out of the pandemic, so there were several safety restrictions, and things were a bit quiet. I'm happy to say that this year it feels like the event was back to full strength, as there have been good crowds for every screening I went to, and we've had some celebrity guests on hand again as well. This year also had such a loaded schedule to the point where I had to make some hard decisions about what to see, though I tended to gravitate toward the newer movies, even as video label Severin premiered some new restorations of a lot of interesting Czech and Japanese horror films. They also sold merchandise in the theater, much to my bank account's horror. I'll admit I picked up a box set. I might go back for another one. We'll see. There were also special parties at the nearby Barcade Bit Bar with the celebrity guests, and a VIP screening that allowed you to watch Night of the Demons with stars Amelia Kincaid and Linnea Quigley. Bit out of my price range, but pretty awesome nonetheless. Anyway, the festival's opening event on Thursday was held in the atrium of the beautiful Peabody Essex Museum. Now, for non-VIP guests, and like I said, I couldn't quite afford that ticket this year, the evening started with comments by festival founder Kay Lynch, who's continued to make the festival an amazing event that promotes not only great movies, but important social values, and she's done so amidst some pushback from some of the more unsavory elements out there, and she has my total admiration for that. Since the overall theme of this year's festival is focused on folk horror, the keynote speaker was author and filmmaker Kayla Janice, who not only wrote the excellent academic horror study House of Psychotic Women, but was the director of the documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, a superb analysis of the folk horror subgenre that has multiple showings at the festival and which we highly recommend. Janice relayed her experiences making the film and how it broadened her view of folk horror beyond its perceived British origins to encompass movies and stories from many cultures and many points of view. The next speaker was Suzanne Romero, widow of my favorite filmmaker George Romero and the founder and president of the George A. Romero Foundation, an organization she created to help preserve Romero's legacy. To that effect, the foundation has also established fellowships for up-and-coming filmmakers, and several of the films I'm about to discuss won some of these fellowships, deservedly so. Finally, the guest of honor for the night appeared, the great Tony Todd. A horror veteran and star of the Candyman films, the Final Destination films, the Hatchet movies, The Crow, the remake of Night of the Living Dead, not to mention his roles in Platoon, The Rock, and various Star Trek series. I might have mentioned in our Candyman episode how when you meet celebrities, sometimes you're surprised to find they're life-size normal people. Tony Todd is one of the few famous people I've met who seemed larger than life. Not only because he's a very tall man, and he is, but he has that amazing voice and just incredible presence, as well as just being a charming dude. He gave a marvelous Q&A session moderated by podcaster and journalist Andrea Subasati of the Faculty of Horror. Subasati, recognizing that Todd is a pro at these kind of events and knowing that so many of the same questions get asked, did a great job of keeping it fresh and interesting while giving Todd the chance to tell some fan-favorite stories, which included such diverse subjects as drunk monkeys, getting directors to fart, and how the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor helped Todd move past the death of his beloved aunt. He capped it off by doing the voice. Now, those of you who are Candyman fans know exactly what I mean. And to hear this charming, personable man suddenly switch it on and turn into his most famous screen persona was really stunning. This was followed by a screening of Candyman right there in the atrium. Now, we've discussed that movie at length in our previous episode on it, so I won't go into too much detail, but two things I want to mention of note. Watching it again after seeing Nia DaCosta's Legacy sequel reboot yielded all sorts of fascinating resonances, and hearing Todd's voice echoing through the wide space of the museum atrium was amazing. So that was a great first night. So Friday night, the first official night of the festival, kicked off with several high-profile features and shorts, including 2 jury prize winners. I do have to note one funny moment as I was waiting to go in the theater and noticed Tony Todd casually walking by, in disguise as he put it, from the night before. I didn't say anything to him because I certainly didn't want to bother him while he's enjoying the Salem tourist experience, but it was kind of wild to see. So moving on to the films, first was the short documentary film Witch Hunt, introduced by directors Melissa James and Sarah Sharkey Pierce. Originally intended to be a feature, but turned into a short due to the restrictions of the pandemic, the film chronicles the renewed interest in Wicca and pagan religions following the rise of Donald Trump. It illustrates how witchcraft can become a unique form of protest as we see covens uniting to cast spells against Trump and his cronies, including frat boy Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and evil Republican turtle Mitch McConnell, and efforts to bind them from harming our country any more than they already have. Considering the origins of the festival itself as a way of pushing back against Trump and the regressive conservative asshats of modern America, It felt like an appropriate start for the festival and was both entertaining and moving. I'd actually really love to see Pierce and James get to extend it into a feature as they originally intended. James was also the producer of the next film, the documentary feature Satan Wants You. This movie examines the truth behind the bestseller Michelle Remembers, an allegedly nonfiction book which purported to tell the story of Michelle Smith and how her work with her therapist Lawrence Pasder uncovered repressed memories of ritualistic abuse by a supposed satanic cult. The success of the book was a major contributing factor to the satanic panic of the 1980s, as readers grew convinced that shadowy satanic groups were out to kidnap their children, and Smith and Pasder's allegations established the kind of lurid and outlandish accusations that would become standard in sensationalized abuse cases such as the McMartin trial, even as the veracity of Smith's claims became increasingly suspect. The best documentaries can mimic the plot twists of fiction by carefully doling out information, changing our conclusions and sometimes leaving us uncertain how to interpret events. Directors Sean Horlor and Steve J. Adams do a great job on this front, allowing vintage interviews, news and talk show segments, real audio recordings of Smith's sessions with Pasder, and their various interview subjects to paint different scenarios about the relationship between Smith and Pasder that hint at their motivations. Was Smith a needy patient who dreamt up tales of horror to maintain the interest of the therapist she was obsessed with? Was Dr. Pasder a fraud who encouraged Smith's recollections to try and create a sensational case and heighten his notoriety? As we currently watch baseless abuse accusations flung around recklessly as a political weapon, this portrait of the mania that can destroy lives is more relevant than ever. Next came two Canadian films that were both Jury Award winners at the festival. First, the winner of the Jury Award for Short Film, Demon Box by Sean Weinstein, a brilliantly unconventional swirl of autobiography and fantasy in which the director uses a story involving a Dybbuk box to depict the profound effect his grandfather's stories of the Holocaust had on his psyche during childhood. I almost don't want to go into too much detail so as not to spoil some of the fascinating choices Weinstein makes. One moment he's gleefully smashing the fourth wall as he points up the artifice of his own production, while the next he's courageously exposing his innermost traumas and insecurities to the audience. It's a simultaneously hilarious and troubling portrait of the generational trauma and guilt the Holocaust continues to inflict on Jewish families, and how horror films can help exorcise these real-life fears. Next came the Festival Jury Award winner for feature film and a recipient of the George A. Romero Foundation Fellowship, Danny Dunlop's chilly psychological thriller Wolves. The movie centers on an unnamed loner who tries to fill up his empty existence by conducting a personal investigation into a series of animal mutilations that have terrorized his community. But as he grows closer to uncovering the identity of the perpetrator, he also delves into the darkness that lurks inside himself. Anchored by a fantastic lead performance by Mark Nosant, the movie mixes vigilante thriller, dark character study, and even, at least thematically, a werewolf movie, with the unnamed protagonist's growing obsession to solve the crime becoming the werewolf bite that infects him and threatens to bring out the beast inside him. In this sense, the film continues the tradition of Jeff Lindsay's Dexter novels or Dan Wells' John Wayne Cleaver books of presenting a character waging exterior battle against evil to fight an interior battle against the same. Nosant does a skillful job presenting his character's subtle transformation, with his submissive posture and awkwardness slowly giving way to a frightening directness and intensity, and Dunlop shows exquisite patience in constructing the narrative, keeping the pacing deliberate until the main character begins ignoring his mundane moving job and his fruitless efforts to date to focus on his obsessive investigation, at which point the editing of the movie picks up speed and intensity to reflect his focus. He also shoots one of the creepiest moments of violence I've seen in a movie in a long time that is all the more shocking for being dead silent, and the movie's also punctuated with some wonderfully moody, omniscient drone shots, and the wintry Canadian landscape builds the movie's sense of isolation and alienation. With its creeping dread and intriguingly murky morality, Wolves is a winner, and Dunlop quickly shows himself a talent to keep an eye on. The night was capped off by a midnight screening of John Carpenter's follow-up to Halloween, The Fog from 1980. I've always felt this is an underappreciated entry in Carpenter's filmography, although time has been kinder to it than its contemporary audiences and reviewers. It also feels appropriate to be in Salem, a town that has certainly profited off of tragedy, and watch a movie where ghosts strike back against the town that betrayed them 100 years before for money. It was also funny to see the film start at 11:55 on April 21st and open on John Houseman's character ominously informing us that it was 5 minutes to midnight and soon would be April 21st. Time for one last ghost story. This synchronicity would continue in the next midnight screening, but more on that in a little bit. Notably restructured and reworked in its post-production, the movie has an offbeat narrative structure, with a slow build-up to the all-out attack by the ghostly sailors of the Elizabeth Dane, and an ensemble cast that never really unites on screen until the third act. But in terms of atmosphere, it's easily the equal of Halloween. Dean Cundy's photography is as top-notch as ever, and what an amazing cast, with Adrienne Barbeau, Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Janet Leigh, and Hal Holbrook, among others. The movie also gives Carpenter several chances to show his skill at generating agonizing, creeping suspense scenes, as the shadowy ghosts close in on our heroes, and his music score is beautifully haunting. That brings us to Saturday, April 22nd, which started off with a repertory screening of The Blood on Satan's Claw, or as our print was titled, Satan's Skin. Long considered to be one of the foundational films of the folk horror subgenre. It features Wendy Padbury, who played one of my favorite Doctor Who companions, Zoe, and Anthony Ainley, who played the Master in the latter half of the original show. This screening would be immediately followed by a live podcast from the Faculty of Horror, hosted by Alexandra West and Andrea Subisati, who come to the festival every year to offer amazing analysis of various movies. Now, I've discussed the high quality of that podcast before, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. One strength of their show was their willingness to poke holes in a sacred cow of the genre, and that was the case here. Now, in the past, I've enjoyed Blood on Satan's Claw overall, despite some reservations with it, mostly a gratuitous rape scene against Padbury's character and some confusion over murky plot points, such as who the protagonist is supposed to be. West and Subisati brought up some interesting bits of production history to explain the latter points, and revealed more unsavory behind-the-scenes elements of the film that make me look at it a little bit differently. But at any rate, you'll be able to hear their thoughts directly before long, so I'll save that for when their episode is released. Next, it was time to get back to new films. Now, it was inevitable given the global horror we've faced since 2020 that we were going to have at least one viral-themed movie among the selections this year, something we saw last year with the screening of Hall. This year, we have Delilah Droge's No More Time, which was shot in the middle of the quarantine and Black Lives Matter protests with a 5-person crew over a scant 6 weeks. The film follows a married couple as they flee to the wilds of Colorado looking for a safe place to hide in the middle of a pandemic that causes madness and death and seems to be responsible for a rash of disappearances. As they move from place to place looking for supplies and shelter, they have to deal with their paranoia about the other local residents and each other's growing suspicion that the other might be infected. Now, during quarantine, Agatha and I had to boycott virus-themed movies simply because the circumstances were a bit too much for us to watch them comfortably then. Watching with a little bit of distance now, I can say that No More Time is on target in depicting some specific elements of the quarantine experience, particularly its psychological effects. It was such an unprecedented turn of events, it was often hard to know what to feel or how to feel in any given circumstance. Something reflected as the main characters are frequently overwhelmed by what's happening and struggle to get their bearings, and something I personally experienced many times during the pandemic. Several characters we encounter in the later stages of infection spit out rants full of rage and self-loathing that I think express a lot of the conflicting emotions we were dealing with during COVID. The movie also depicts the confusion we all experienced regarding the facts of the virus itself and how to protect against it, and of course, unfortunately, the viciousness of anti-masker and anti-vaxxer sentiment, which this movie slyly suggests can be just as infectious as any disease. Droge plays out the human drama against the beautiful Colorado landscapes and some really amazing footage of wildlife straying into abandoned human habitats, a reflection of how, as we were quarantined, the natural world began to take back some of its lost territory. This leads to a final turn of the film that propels it into a different area that I think works better on a thematic level than it did a narrative one. And along those lines, several supporting characters in the film, such as Noah, a black survivor that Steve has several encounters with, and a mysterious Native American man who wanders around the edge of the film, both end up feeling more like symbols than fully fledged characters. Still, the unique circumstances of the film's production, the visual panache of the movie, and the salient points it offers about our collective quarantine trauma definitely merit a viewing. Next came another recipient of the George A. Romero Foundation Fellowship, Elise Finnerty's The Ones You Didn't Burn, which, besides having an amazing title, continues the festival's folk horror and witchcraft theme as it tells the story of two siblings, Nathan and Mara, who travel back to the family farm they grew up on to negotiate its sale following the suicide of their father. Nathan, a recovering addict who is trying to keep on the straight and narrow, finds being home contains many temptations and traumas, and as the pair interact with the two attractive sisters who worked on the farm for their father, Nathan grows suspicious of their motives while Mara is drawn into their world. Is Nathan losing his already tenuous grip on reality, or do the sisters have sinister intentions for the siblings? Finnerty packs the film with disconcerting imagery and an atmosphere of tragedy, while definitely avoiding the cliches of the genre, and happily is more than willing to keep the nature of what's really happening ambiguous. It's the kind of film that different viewers can walk away from with really different interpretations of whether the events we see are real or imagined by the main characters. Generational trauma and guilt also seem to be running themes for the films in the festival this year, and that continues here as questions begin to arise about the history of Nathan and Mara's ancestors, with the audience left to ponder whether these two actually deserve some kind of comeuppance for the actions of the previous generations. Nathan Wallace and Jenna Rose Sander do an excellent job suggesting the deep conflicted history between the two flawed main characters, who never take actions that insult the viewer's intelligence even as they make grave errors. Meanwhile, Finnerty and Estelle Gerard Parks are beguiling and sinister as the two sisters, but never overplay their characters, putting us on the same unsteady ground as Nathan. This is an excellent haunting film, and Finnerty is another filmmaker to watch. Now, anthology films can often be a mixed bag, and that is the case with Pendulum, a collection of stories by 7 different directors about witchcraft that has a few mediocre tales, but a few really shining high points. The film is bound together by a wraparound story as a young aspiring witch tries to talk her way into a mentorship from an elder witch who relates a series of stories about other members of her coven. The resulting stories don't completely fit the concept or tone of this framing device, and some of the tales lack a strong through line, but I do overall have to recommend the movie for a few of the better segments. First of all, there's Cutter, written and directed by Daniel Rapp and Lindsay Young, which features an outstanding performance by Nadia Alexander as a self-harming young woman whose body bears the physical effects of her relationship with a troubled friend. Then there's Bruja, directed by Steven DeGennaro, which is easily the most effective segment, a suspenseful, mostly single-location tale of a young mother who considers taking drastic measures after her abusive ex-husband kidnaps her daughter. Even before we get any supernatural elements, this one really puts the audience through the ringer, with a sharp script by DeGennaro and Scott Weinberg, a superb lead performance by Jessica Perrin, and a terrific final sting. Finally, there's Albatross, written and directed by Savannah Ray, a trippy and surprisingly moving story of a woman whose visit to her father's mausoleum becomes a journey backward into her personal history of horror. So while the overall film is uneven, there's enough impressive work here to recommend seeing it, at the very least for Bruja. That one is just really something special. Next, we come to one of the most fun films of the festival so far, and another George A. Romero Fellowship recipient, Alexandra Spith's Stag, which manages to stick the landing in that most difficult of genre mashups, the horror comedy. Mary Glenn Frederick stars as Jenny, a woman stuck in a dead-end telemarketing job and little to show for her life, who discovers that Mandy, a childhood friend she had a painful falling out with, is getting married. After Jenny reaches out to her on the phone, Mandy impulsively invites Jenny to her bachelorette party at a remote campsite in upstate New York, where Jenny must contend with repairing her friendship with Mandy, dealing with Mandy's strange circle of friends, and fighting her fears that the urban legends regarding the campground's violent history might be about to come true. The script brings to mind elements of Bridesmaids and other comedies, and while it isn't hard to predict the various beats of the story, right up to the final scene, that's hardly a problem when the journey to that end is so entertaining, and Spith manages to pull off some amazing switches in tone, with the film bouncing between broad comedy, suspense, and even some really moving moments as Jenny and Mandy grapple with their painful personal history. With Jenny, Spith gives us a protagonist who is hilariously off-kilter, the kind of socially inept person unsure quite what to say or how to act in polite company, and whose outdated clothing and unrefined behavior suggest someone who peaked during her teenage years only to come up short when it came to adult life. But then Spith turns the tables around by surrounding Jenny with supporting characters who are all off-kilter in their own unique ways, forcing us to identify with Jenny as we navigate the cringe-inducing awkwardness of this social situation with her. The showstopper, and a scene no one at my screening could stop talking about, is an uproarious scene where Mandy and her bachelorette guest bond by going on a drug trip together, leaving a chemically uncommunicative Jenny struggling to express her suspicions about what's happening even as her internal monologue continues. Frederick is brilliant in the scene, and Spith employs some simple but effective camera tricks to convey Jenny's drug-addled mind. I also have to give huge credit to Elizabeth Ramos, cast in the straight woman role as Mandy, who nevertheless makes the character interesting and memorable, and Sophia Harris as Leslie, the most sensible and normal of Mandy's friends. This one is a ton of fun. As it happens, the next film in the schedule serves as kind of a companion piece to Stag, as Bury the Bride, directed by musician and filmmaker Spider-One and written by Spider-One and Chrissy Fox, follows another unusual bachelorette party. In this case, bride-to-be June, played by horror icon Scout Taylor Compton, leads her sister Sadie and a group of friends into the desert for a pre-wedding party at a rundown shack that her fiancé David, whom none of the others have met, has rented for. Before long, David and his intimidating friends interrupt the festivities and reveal their bloody plans for the ladies. Now, I have to talk around what those plans are because the big reveal is actually a really effective moment and a genuine shocking surprise. But I'll admit, for me, the rest of the film falls a bit flat, much of which I have to attribute to how the characters are written. Dylan Rourke delivers the menace required for his role as super redneck David, but the script never allows him to show the kind of charm that would make it believable that June would fall for him, or give he and his band of marauders enough backstory or character to make them interesting. Chaz Bono fares better as David's silent lackey puppy, balancing some really visceral moments with hints that his character has more going on than is evident on first glance. Co-writer Fox also fares better in the role of Sadie, trying to support her sister's decisions even as they seem foolish, but that brings us to the film's most glaring flaw. Now, if the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that people can't always be counted on to do the smart thing, and there's been a lot of debate about whether we've all been too hard on the bad decision-making shown by characters in horror movies. With that being said, and through no fault on Compton's part, June's reactions to what's happening in the film are so ridiculous and insipid, it kind of broke the movie for me. The others in June's bridal party end up thinly written and don't really make much impact despite the considerable efforts of the actors involved. Though I do have to praise the film's excellent makeup and gore effects, and the sparse desert environment of the film makes a nice change from the standard spooky forested area you'd expect this kind of story to be set in. The film does offer some interesting tweaks on a bit of classic horror movie lore, though I wish it had gone further in this regard. As it stands, Bury the Bride is diverting, but nothing that hasn't been done better before, even by some movies also playing in this festival. The last film I have to discuss is another midnight repertory screening, Lamberto Bava's Demons from 1985. So, What's better than going to a midnight showing in a movie theater of a film where a bunch of people go to a movie theater to see a film that unleashes demons that attack them? How about seeing that movie introduced by Jaretta, the horror icon who plays the first character to be possessed? Now, Jaretta is a force of nature, and her intro and quick Q&A before the film was a delight, with her expressing her appreciation of the genre, giving a few behind-the-scenes notes about the movie, and taking pride in the various movies in her filmography. She is wonderful. As for Demons itself, it's a ton of fun, with some gore effects that are still effective 30 years later, and unabashed gonzo storytelling. This is a movie where characters can buzz through a theater on a motorcycle armed with a samurai sword, or a helicopter can randomly drop through a ceiling, and you just take it in stride. It also features one of my all-time favorite fake-out endings, which always succeeds in making the audience jump. It is one of my favorite midnight movies. So, with such a full schedule for the weekend, when it came to Sunday, I felt like I was going to collapse with exhaustion, so honestly, I had to take that day to recover. As a result, I missed several features, including Brightwood, Summoners, Your Love Is Mine, and In a Dark, Dark Room, along with several Severin restorations, including Bakaneko and The Ninth Heart. My apologies for missing all these films, and I hope to catch up with them down the line. So the festival continues this weekend, Friday, April 28th to Sunday, April 30th, and this second block will include some highly anticipated films, such as Saint Drogo and Alice Mayo McKay's T-Blockers, along with repertory screenings of The Hitcher, The Blair Witch Project, one of my favorites from the 90s, and Fright Night 2, which is kind of a rare one to see on the big screen. You can bet I'm going to try to see as much of it as I can, and we'll report back with more reviews. In the meantime, huge thanks to Kay Lynch, founder of the festival, and all the volunteers, filmmakers, and fellow attendees, as well as the wonderful staff and management of Cinema Salem for making it such a fun and pleasant experience. I'll be back soon with coverage of weekend number 2. That ends the discussion, but not the conversation. If you'd like to have your say about weekend 1 of Salem Horror Fest number 6, or feel that I missed something, which, since I missed Sunday, I kind of did, check out the comment section for this episode on CinemaSpection.com and start talking. Email your comments, complaints, questions, and suggestions to cinemaspection@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter at CinemaSpection. We're also on Instagram under CinemaSpection. Our show is available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Amazon Music, so if you like what you hear, please subscribe, and if you have a moment, please leave us a review there. We appreciate your feedback, and your reviews help increase our visibility. We're also now part of the Fireside Alliance podcast network. Check out some of the other great shows on the network at www.firesidealliance.com and join our Discord. We'll be back to discuss another movie next time. Until then, thanks for listening, and remember to keep watching closely. There's more to a movie than what's on the screen. This film festival business, it's a game for the young.